Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's asynchronous course content. This week, we're going to be talking about an extremely important topic, which is building communicative competence. And so you might ask yourself, what is that? What are we talking about? Well, if you think about it, it's exactly what it sounds like. We want to make sure that we are providing direct instruction to our students in communication so that they become competent communicators, so they can communicate not only their wants and their needs, but their ideas, their knowledge, their opinions, so that they have agency over their life, so that they can engage in social interactions. And so I think if you stop and think about how often you are communicating and what all that does to make you have a full and integrated life and how that adds to your happiness, then it's easy to understand why we need to make sure that we are explicitly teaching communication. And unfortunately, I've been in a lot of classrooms where that is not a targeted area that is explicitly being taught. But we want you not to be those teachers. You are going to be teachers who are explicitly teaching communication because you're going to learn about it this week. And so before we get started, just kind of want to go over what's coming up, important things that will be coming up that you need to submit. So one of them is your discussion guide for week 11. And you may have noticed that your discussion guides look a little bit different now, and they're not just straight questions. So what I'm going to be doing and what you will do in week 11 is you are going to complete a module on seating and positioning. And so why are we doing that instead of having our typical discussion guides? Well, the reason that we're doing that is because at the end of it, you're going to take a pre-test and a post-test. And then at the end, you're either going to walk away with a certification, a certificate that says you have completed that training, or you can take a screenshot of your assessment at the end. So make sure you do this. And then you can add those things to your resume when you are applying for teaching positions. It just shows you have additional training. You also have your last two quizzes coming up. One is on science, the other one is on communicative competence, and then that's it. Yay, you'll be finished with all of your quizzes for the semester. You also have your try and apply for your small group math to come and do. I just want to make sure that everyone is paying close attention and getting your lessons, those try and applies taken care of for your one-on-one math group and your small math group, small group instruction, because you have science coming up and the semester is going to start like really coming fast. And so we want to make sure we get all of that stuff in before the end of the semester. And then also you have another opportunity for extra credit. We're going to be talking about in the next week, we're going to be talking about providing support for health and medical needs. And so you can do an interview with your cooperating teacher, answer a couple of questions related to the safety and crisis management plan, and then submit that. And then you can get 2 extra credit points to go towards your end of the semester grade. You can apply it to whatever you would like. Also, just want to make note that the last day for all resubmissions, and those resubmissions would be for any projects or any quizzes, that those resubmissions are due by April 3rd unless the assignment falls after that date. So again, important stuff that's going to be coming up. So, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about building that communication competence. We're going to tap into AAC devices. I do believe that's going to be a review for this group. We're going to also talk about how you can plan for communication so that academics and communication are related. How are they related and how do we plan for that? We're going to talk about the different symbolic levels or way that students access communication and express themselves. And then we're going to do just a little touch on functional communication training. And so my hope is that you've had some of that in your ABA course. And so again, we're just going to kind of give you an overview of what that might look like. And then when we're in person, we've got some small group activities that we're going to work on. As always, your learning objectives are not only in the PowerPoint, but they are also on Canvas if you would like to review those. So one of the things, one request that came out of the mid-course evaluation was a request that I number the questions in the videos. So here's my response. You now have numbered questions in our videos thanks to one of your peers. So question number 1 is, why is communication important? So I want you to think about yourself. Why is communication important for you? And then do just a quick write, again, 1 to 2 minutes, and then come back after you finish. Go ahead and stop your video now. All right, I look forward to seeing your answers and to talking about why communication is important once we are together on Monday. So when I think about communication and why it's important to me, one of the main reasons is it allows me participation in life, participation with friends, participation in the wider community, and so it really is an entry point for access to information, access to social interaction, access to things that you enjoy. Not only that, but it is also important for academic assessment. How do we assess students? We assess them through some form of communication. Sometimes that is vocal communication, sometimes it's using an AAC device, sometimes it's writing a response. We already talked about social interactions and how important communication is for social interactions, but I want you to stop for a moment and think about just in the past week how often or how many times you have communicated related to a social interaction, whether that's texting a friend and asking to hang out, whether you're engaged in a conversation with someone. But it's also important for expressing things like your wants, your needs, your opinions, your knowledge, your ideas. So, again, in order for our students to become competent communicators, we have to explicitly teach communication. Now, one of the things I want to make sure that we're all really clear on, I want us to all get on the same boat with this one. And you're going to hear me say this multiple times throughout this week and throughout any time I'm working with you is that what we sometimes see as a failure of a student to behave properly is actually a failure to communicate properly. So I want you to stop for a second and think of one of your students, a student you have now or a student that you've known, who has been labeled as having challenging behaviors. And I'm not saying they're not challenging, but I want you to stop and think, what was the student trying to communicate through those behaviors? Were they trying to communicate that they didn't want to engage in whatever activity you were asking them to engage in? Was that behavior actually communicating that they wanted something that they didn't have access to? So, an important thing to remember is that all behavior is communication, and that is a reality. And so, when you frame behavior in that way, it really helps you to approach it in a different way because suddenly you don't see the student as being bad or being hard. What you see is a student who is trying to communicate something but doesn't have an appropriate way to do it. And because they don't have an appropriate way to communicate whatever that need, want, etc. is, they use whatever tools they have. And they use what tools have been effective in the past as well. So think about what types of communication that you're reinforcing. So, why communication? Well, as I've stated, and I hope you've gotten, is that this is a priority for instruction. It is a priority because how do we access reading through communication? How do we demonstrate our knowledge in math through communication? So, again, this is priority instruction that has to be explicitly, directly taught. This is part of your specialized instruction. Why? Why do we want to make sure that we're stressing communication? Because the ability to communicate increases people's quality of life. Again, imagine if you can't communicate what the quality of your life is. Now imagine that you can. It increases access. We've already talked about social engagement, but it also increases self-determination, self-regulation, and so much more. So this is important, and it's important to you just as a person because when your students are able to communicate, they are more successful. They have better student outcomes. They're more socially engaged. They're happier. You have a more knowledge about what their wants and needs are. But not only that, when students lack effective communication, they really end up having a very passive life, because now they lack those things. They lack access, they lack social engagement, self determination, self regulation, and so much more. And not only that, lacking communication can possibly put you in dangerous situations. And I can tell you from 32 years of experience, and this is the harsh realities, I have had students who were put in dangerous situations because they were not able to communicate. And so, again, what I want to make sure that I just really stress over and over again is that behavior is communication. So, you always have to look at that behavior and try to figure out what is the student trying to communicate. That's how important it is. I even stuck another arrow in there. So we want to make sure that every student's voice matters. And voices can look very different, right? Voices could be through AAC devices. They could be through eye gaze. They could be through a body movement. They could be through the use of sign. But just imagine if your voice didn't matter to someone. Imagine what it feels like to attempt to communicate and no one responds. Imagine that you're hungry and you're using eye gaze to look at lunch that's on the counter and nobody responds, and you're trying to communicate that you're hungry. So, we want to make sure that we don't ignore anybody's words. And this is a little poster on the side, which I love, and I would encourage you to print off as a reminder, especially when you're working with your own classroom staff, is that when a communicator says a word, and that word could look very different, right? It could be a gesture, and you aren't sure why, it may be easy to just brush it off and pretend like that was an error. They just pushed it by accident, but don't do that. Just because you don't understand the communication doesn't mean that it doesn't count. It does count. So there are different ways that you can respond when you come across things like that. You could say something like, "You said go. Where would you like to go?" Or you might say, "That's an interesting word. Do you have something else you want to say about that?" Or you might say something like, "I don't see the bus right now. Did you see the bus today?" So again, we don't want to ignore anybody's words, however they're speaking to us, because their words matter. And so you're going to look at a video on facilitated communication. And so I just want to give you a heads up that I'd like everybody to be prepared to share their thoughts on that facilitated communication video when we're together on Monday. All right, here comes question number 2. What types of communication have you seen in your classrooms, in your schools, could be in your churches and the community? So, what types of communication have you seen? And again, we're thinking specifically about students with complex support needs. So, go ahead and stop your video, respond to question number 2, and then come on back when you're done. All right, let's keep going. So, another one of the things you're going to do, if you haven't done so already, is that before class on Monday, I want you to review the Communication Bill of Rights. And I want you to specifically be ready to respond to in class what stands out to you and how does this apply to your students or student in your classroom. And so, when we think about the Communication Bill of Rights, here is an example of what it says. All people with disabilities have the extent, excuse me, let me say that again. All people with disabilities of any extent or severity has a basic right to affect through communication, because our communication affects something, the conditions of their existence. Think about that. They have a right to affect the conditions of their existence. And beyond that general right, a number of specific communication rights should ensure that all daily interactions and intervention involving persons with severe disabilities. And so they should be able to fully communicate, participate in communication interactions, and they have a right to things like the right to interact socially and maintain social closeness and build relationships, the right to express personal preferences and feelings, the right to make comments and share ideas, the right to be informed about people and events in their lives. They have the right to have clear, meaning, and culturally and linguistically appropriate communication. So I want you to hear that. That is extremely important for many students that you're going to serve. That not only do they have a right to being able to ask for and give information, but they have a right to have clear, meaningful, and culturally and linguistically appropriate communications. So again, this is something you're going to look over, review for Monday, and then we're going to have a discussion about it in class. So next we're going to talk about the components of communication. And this is really a core part of what we're going to be talking about today. So pay close attention, all right? So we're going to talk about the components of communication. So one of the components is the form. And when you think about form, it's how you communicate. It's the method or the mode that you use. So you might use vocal speech. You might use an AAC device. You might use sign language. So again, how you communicate is the form. And pay attention to these because you'll plan for these things when you're teaching communication. The next component is the content, and that's like the vocabulary you're going to be using, the type of sentence structure you're going to use, and it's really the meaning you're trying to communicate. So the content is what you are communicating, and we'll have examples of this in just a minute. And then finally, the third component is the function. And when you think about the function, it's why a person is communicating. And examples might be they're requesting something, they are communicating for social engagement, or they might be communicating to protest. And I want to make sure that when we are providing students with opportunities to communicate, that we are providing them and listening to them when they protest or say no to things. I have a right to say no, you have a right to say no, they have a right to say no. Now that is within reason, right? We're in schools, but when those types of choices are available, then we want to make sure that we're listening and providing that opportunity. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a video, and in this video, I want you specifically to look for the form, the content, and the function of this child's communication. And so one of the things that you may want to go ahead and do is to make a table that has those columns and maybe one more so you can write in there what you're referring to. But because later in our videos, you're going to be assessing and looking for the form, the content, and the function. So let's look at our little fella here. Let me make sure I turn my volume all the way up. All right, here we go.
Go.
All right, did you see that? Do I need to play it again? If so, it is in the PowerPoint. Yeah, in the PowerPoint, you're more than welcome to go look for it. So what I want you to do now is I want you to stop the video, and then I want you to write what was the form of his communication, what was the content of his communication, and then what was the function. And on the content and the function, that might look different for each of us. We might just word it differently, okay? So go ahead and stop your video and then come back when you're done. All right, so let's look at what was the form of his communication. He was using an AAC device, right? That's what he was using to communicate. That's how he was communicating. What was the content? Well, he was using vocabulary. He said things like spin, ready, set, go. So that's his vocabulary, and you can also look at that as being sentence structure because he was saying ready, set, go. Those were commands. And then what was the function of his behavior? He was requesting something, right? He was requesting somebody to play with him, to spin him. And so that was why he was communicating. So I'd be really interested to see how you came. And again, you may not have worded it that exact same way, but if as long as you got the idea of what he was communicating, what the function of it was, then we're good. All right, let's keep going. So here is another video we're going to watch, and I want you to do the exact same thing. I want you to write what is the form of the student's communication. They're two different individuals, not students, individuals here. What is the content of their communication? And then what is the function of their communication? So let's watch now.
I hear that you two are best friends.
Yeah.
What is it like to be best friends?
Like, we hang out, go to the park and have fun and play.
Tell me about your best friend, Mac.
He's nice, he's funny. I have little boyfriend. What's that?
What did you think when he said that, Tegan?
Wait, he embarrassed me, and he embarrassed me a lot.
Mac, do you like to embarrass Tegan?
Yeah. Man, don't you embarrass me, man. Awkward. Awkward.
All right, let's go ahead and stop that. And what I want you to do is to identify the form, the content, and the function of their communication. Go ahead and stop your video and then come on back. All right, so let's look at what was the form of their communication. Well, we had vocal speech. You would also be correct if you were to say something like body language, because we can even look at this video, at this section of the video right here, and she's using her body language as well to communicate, right? So we could say vocal speech, or if you put body language, that's correct as well. What was the content? Well, they had vocabulary like things like awkward, and they had sentence structure. So his sentence structure was boyfriend, girlfriend, right? And so if you notice that the content was really engaging with sharing information, that's part of what the function was. They were engaging in a social exchange, and that was the function of it, is that they were engaging in social conversation. So again, you could see very different levels of language, but their form, their content, and the function were all the same, even though the students were at different levels. I also want to make sure that you pay close attention and notice the impact of having a language model, which would be the girl, for the other individual, and how that supported his language development. So that's an example of how you can engage peers in order to be language models for the students that you're working with. So, I want to make sure that you know that one form can have multiple functions. So, one form of language or communication can have different types of functions. And here are some examples. So, a student might say help, that's the form. They're saying help to request assistance. So, that is the function. The function is to request assistance. But a student could also say help, the exact same form, to gain attention from a teacher. That's a completely different function. Or a student could say help. Now, all of these are the exact same form of saying help, but this time they may say help and the function is to get out of work. They know somebody's going to come and give them the answer, for example, or they're going to let them go. So that they might say help in order to get out of work, and that is a completely different function. So this form of help does not have the same function as this form of help, which does not have the same function as this form of help. So again, one form can have multiple functions. So when we're talking about form, content, and function, let's try it out and see what that might look like in a scenario. So in this scenario, during a math lesson, a student raises their hand and says, "I don't get it." So when I'm looking at the form is verbal. That's the spoken word that they give, but they've also combined it with a nonverbal because it said they raised their hand. So it's verbal plus a nonverbal. And is the content of what they are communicating? They're expressing difficulty with the math problem. That's when they said, "I don't get it." That is saying, "I'm having difficulty with this." And what was the function? It was either to request help, they wanted someone to come and help them with the math problem, or they needed some kind of clarification. So again, that's an example of form, content, and function. Now let's look at another one. In this one, a student points to a picture of a sad face and frowns. So again, there's a sad face, point to it, and then frowns afterwards. So what is the form of that? Well, we have a nonverbal form of communication. Not only are they pointing, but they also have the facial expression of frowning. And then they're combining that with an AAC device, which is the picture communication. It's a low tech, right? That's a low tech device. What is the content? Well, they could be indicating that they're sad, that they're experiencing sadness, that feeling. And the function could be that they're either just expressing their emotion to let you know how they're feeling, or they may be expressing that because they need some type of support. So again, that's we're looking at the form, the content, and the function. And when you are planning for your communication instruction, you're going to plan for all three of those components. All right, let's do a quick check-in with yourself. How are you feeling so far? How are you feeling about form, content, and function? If you're here, fantastic. Keep on rolling. If you're here or here, as always, I'm going to ask that you submit somewhere in a document with your discussion guide, that you submit your questions so I can make sure that I answer them on Monday, because questions are always, always, always welcome. All right, that's the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one.